It was a quiet morning outside the Tokyo District Courthouse, the kind of morning when everything seemed too ordinary to be remarkable. The sun was soft, the air crisp, and people moved with their usual calm pace. Among the small crowd walking toward the courthouse was a Japanese woman named Reina. She carried a slim black briefcase and wore a neat dark suit that made her look professional but not flashy. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable, and she seemed focused on something beyond the noise and motion around her. She had arrived early, earlier than most. It wasn't her first time there, but today mattered more than usual. Inside that courthouse, a major corruption hearing was about to take place. One involving powerful business figures and officials suspected of laundering money across international borders. Reina's role in that case wasn't something she could talk about. To anyone watching, she looked like an ordinary woman coming for a hearing or a work meeting. But behind that quiet look, she carried responsibilities that reached far beyond what anyone there could guess. The front of the courthouse was crowded that morning. Security was tighter than usual because the case had drawn attention from journalists and protesters. Police officers lined the main walkway, checking IDs and keeping people from getting too close to the gates. Reporters stood nearby with cameras ready, trying to catch any official or witness they could question. Reina walked calmly through the crowd, keeping her briefcase close. She wasn't there to attract attention. She was there to observe quietly to meet a contact inside. Her papers were in order, her badge safely tucked away inside the briefcase. But as she approached the main entrance, she noticed one police officer staring at her with suspicion. He was tall, in his early 30s perhaps, with a serious face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He watched her approach, then stepped forward to block her path. "Where are you headed?" he asked sharply. Reina stopped, keeping her voice steady. She replied politely that she had business inside and needed to enter for an official matter. Her Japanese was fluent but carried a faint accent, something that often made people pause, wondering where she was really from. The officer frowned and asked for identification. Reina nodded, setting down her briefcase to reach for her papers. But before she could open it, another officer nearby called out to her, asking what organization she was from. The attention suddenly drew several eyes toward her. Some passers-by slowed down to watch. Reina felt the familiar tension that came when people assumed she didn't belong. She opened her briefcase slowly, careful not to move too quickly, and took out a small folder containing her legal documents for the day. The officer looked at them but didn't seem satisfied. "These don't explain why you're here," he said, his tone getting colder. Reina tried again to explain. She told him she was expected inside, and that her contact in the courthouse could verify her clearance. But the officer wasn't listening. He seemed more focused on her calmness, as if her confidence itself offended him. People began whispering nearby. One woman with a camera phone raised it slightly, curious about the argument. Reina glanced around and noticed the uneasy looks. She didn't want attention, especially not now. The officer folded his arms and said she needed to step back and wait until he confirmed her reason for being there. Reina, still calm, replied that she had already checked in with courthouse security earlier that week, and that her name was on the clearance list for that morning. She even offered to wait quietly near the side entrance so she wouldn't block the gate. But for reasons only he understood, the officer's tone hardened. He ordered her to stand still and not touch her bag. His voice grew louder, enough to make nearby people turn their heads. A few journalists moved closer, sensing a story. Reina stayed still, her eyes steady. She wasn't used to being treated this way, especially not while she was technically on duty. But she knew losing her composure would only make things worse. She clasped her hands in front of her and took a slow breath. "I'm only here to attend a hearing," she said quietly. "You can confirm that inside." The officer muttered something under his breath and looked her over again. The situation was starting to feel more like a scene than a check. It was as if he needed to prove something, to show authority in front of the growing crowd. Reina tried to de-escalate. She took a small step back and said she'd wait until someone from the courthouse verified her clearance. But as she turned slightly to move aside, the officer misread her movement. He barked at her to stop. When she instinctively raised her hand to show she wasn't resisting, he moved closer and roughly grabbed her arm. The crowd gasped. A few people began recording. Reina looked up at him, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. She didn't pull away, she just froze. "Don't move," he snapped. I said don't reach for anything. Her briefcase slipped from her hand and hit the ground with a dull thud. Papers fluttered across the pavement. The noise of cameras clicking mixed with murmurs from the onlookers. One older man nearby shouted, "She wasn't doing anything." But the officer ignored him. Raina took another breath, still trying to stay calm. Her cheek was red from the rough handling and her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Officer, please," she said softly. "You're making a mistake." He didn't listen. Another officer approached, asking what was happening, and the first one waved him off. The situation had gone from tense to humiliating in seconds. People began to shout, telling the police to stop. But Raina didn't fight back. She stayed still, eyes steady on the man who had grabbed her. Inside, she felt a storm of emotion, frustration, disbelief, and a cold wave of sadness. She had faced hostility before, but rarely in such a public way. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Even the other officers seemed unsure how to react now that everyone was watching. The air felt heavy, full of quiet judgment. Finally, the officer seemed to realize how many phones were pointed at him. He loosened his grip but didn't apologize. He stepped back, muttering something about following procedure. Raina knelt to gather her papers, her hands steady despite the tremor running through her body. She didn't look up. She didn't say anything else. But her silence said enough. It was the silence of someone who had been underestimated too many times and knew exactly what that meant. A small piece of paper fluttered to the ground beside her shoe. It was the clearance document for the hearing, one signed by a senior official who had requested her presence that day. A young woman from the crowd stepped forward and picked it up, handing it to Raina quietly. Their eyes met for a moment, and Raina nodded in gratitude. She stood, dusted off her suit, and took a slow breath. The officer's eyes flicked toward her briefcase, which was still half open on the ground. He seemed nervous now, realizing that the scene had drawn more attention than he intended. Raina bent down, closed her case, and looked at him for the first time with something different in her gaze. Not anger, but disappointment. She could have spoken then, could have revealed who she truly was, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she simply said in a calm and clear voice that she would wait for his supervisor. The crowd murmured again. One of the courthouse guards hurried over, looking confused by what he saw. He recognized her face instantly, though, and his expression changed from confusion to alarm. "Ma'am," he said quickly, "please come with me. They've been expecting you inside." The police officer looked startled. He turned toward the guard, realizing too late that something wasn't right about his assumptions. Raina nodded silently and followed the guard, holding her briefcase tightly. The people around watched as she walked through the courthouse doors, leaving behind a stunned silence and a group of officers who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was different, quiet, controlled, and respectful. The staff who saw her nodded politely, addressing her by title. The officer outside, however, had no idea who he had just confronted. For Raina, the morning's events weren't over yet, but as she took her seat inside the courtroom, she knew one thing for certain. What had just happened outside would not go unnoticed. She touched her cheek gently, feeling where his hand had struck, and exhaled a long breath. The sting would fade, but the moment wouldn't. Because sometimes, the calmest people carry the deepest power, and soon enough, everyone outside that courthouse was about to find out exactly who she was. Outside the courthouse, the crowd still buzzed with whispers about what had just happened. Some people lingered, trying to understand who that woman was. A few had already sent the short video clips they recorded to social media. And though Raina didn't know it yet, her calm face would soon appear on dozens of screens. But inside the courthouse, she was focused on something else entirely. The courtroom hallways were lined with officers and staff. When the guard escorted her in, the mood shifted. People greeted her with quiet respect. A few bowed slightly as she passed. The difference between how she had been treated outside and how she was treated inside couldn't have been greater. But Raina didn't let that show. Her expression stayed calm. She wasn't someone who let emotions decide her actions. The guard walked her to a small waiting room behind the courtroom. A senior officer was already there, speaking with a court clerk. When he saw her, his eyes widened with surprise and embarrassment. He immediately stood and greeted her with a deep bow. "Agent Raina," he said softly, "we've been waiting for you. I apologize for the confusion at the entrance." She gave a polite nod, her voice steady. It's all right. I understand security is tight today. He looked uneasy, clearly aware that something more had happened. I just received a message from the gate officers. There seems to have been an incident. Would you like me to look into it? Raina hesitated for a moment. She could still feel the faint sting on her cheek, but she shook her head. Not right now. We'll handle it after the hearing. The officer nodded, though his eyes told her he already understood more than she was saying. He stepped aside to let her sit, offering water and a folder containing the schedule for the day. She thanked him quietly and opened it, reviewing the notes. The meeting she was there for involved several officials from the Ministry of Justice and representatives from an international law enforcement task force. They were supposed to discuss an ongoing investigation about a financial network connected to both Japanese and foreign companies. Raina's role was as an FBI liaison. Her job was to share intelligence gathered from U.S. sources that could help the Japanese authorities trace illegal transfers. As she read, her mind drifted back to the officer outside. She could still see his face, the flash of anger in his eyes when he misunderstood her calmness for defiance. She wasn't angry, more disappointed. She had seen this kind of reaction before, though not often in public. People sometimes made quick judgments, especially when they didn't understand someone's background. But this time it wasn't just rude, it was unprofessional and dangerous. Her phone buzzed. It was a secure message from her FBI liaison contact in Washington. She quickly scanned it, then set it down. The investigation was at a delicate stage, and any disturbance, especially public attention, could create unnecessary problems. She needed the hearing to go smoothly. Moments later, an aide knocked and told her the meeting was about to begin. She rose, gathered her things, and followed him through the side door into the courtroom chamber. The room was filled with quiet murmurs, papers rustling, and the sound of shoes against polished floors. When she entered, several heads turned toward her. The presiding judge acknowledged her presence with a slight nod. Representatives from the police, customs, and ministry departments were seated around a large table. Raina took her seat at the far end, near a small nameplate that simply read Liaison Officer. The discussion began with formal introductions. As each department reported updates, Raina listened closely, jotting down notes. When it came her turn, she stood and presented her findings in fluent Japanese. Her tone was respectful but confident. She outlined details about the movement of funds between shell companies, evidence of cross-border money laundering, and suspicious connections between local businesses and overseas accounts. Her calm professionalism immediately earned respect. Even those who hadn't met her before were impressed by how clearly she explained complex data. For a few moments, the unpleasant scene outside faded from her mind. Here, she was in her element, methodical, clear, and sharp. But just as she finished her presentation, a court clerk entered quietly and whispered something to the presiding official. The man's expression shifted, and he looked toward Raina. "Agent Raina," he said gently, "I believe there's a situation outside that requires your attention." Her chest tightened slightly. "A situation?" He nodded, then leaned closer and said quietly, "It appears a misunderstanding occurred at the main gate. One of the officers may have overstepped. There are reporters outside now." For a second, the room went silent. Raina knew what that meant. The incident had already reached the media. She thanked the official and excused herself, walking quickly out of the courtroom. In the hallway, the same senior officer from earlier met her halfway, his face pale with worry. "The footage is spreading fast," he said in a low voice. "It's on several news feeds already. The officer involved didn't realize who you were. Headquarters has been informed." Raina sighed softly. "That was the last thing we needed today." He nodded, looking ashamed. "We're handling it. The Inspector General is on his way to issue a formal apology. The officer who struck you is being questioned." Raina didn't respond immediately. Her first instinct was to stop the punishment. She didn't want the situation to become about personal humiliation or revenge. What mattered to her was accountability and respect, not punishment for its own sake. "I'll speak with the inspector myself," she said quietly. "Let's not turn this into a spectacle. There's work to do." The officer nodded, clearly relieved by her composed response. As they walked toward the private meeting room, a few courthouse staff members peeked from their offices, whispering softly. They had all heard what happened. Some looked apologetic, others curious. But Reina ignored the stares. Her mind was focused on controlling the damage. When she entered the small conference room, the inspector was already waiting. He stood as she walked in and immediately bowed deeply. "Agent Reina, on behalf of the department, I sincerely apologize for what occurred outside. It was a disgraceful act and we take full responsibility." Reina remained silent for a moment, then said gently, "Thank you. I appreciate your apology, but I don't want this to escalate. The officer made a mistake, one that came from poor judgment, not malice." The inspector looked surprised by her calmness. Even so, it was unacceptable. He failed to follow protocol and disrespected an international officer. "The public response is already severe," she sighed, leaning slightly against the table. "I understand. But what's more important right now is restoring cooperation. If the media keeps focusing on this, it will distract from the ongoing case." "That can't happen." The inspector nodded slowly. "Understood. We'll issue a short statement clarifying your role and the misunderstanding." "We'll handle it discreetly," Reina agreed. Her tone was steady, but inside she felt a quiet heaviness. She didn't like being the center of public attention. She had built her career on discretion, on letting results speak for her. Now, an impulsive moment by one man had turned her presence into a headline. Hours later, when the meeting was over, she left through a side exit to avoid reporters. The afternoon sun had softened, and the air carried the hum of traffic. As she stepped outside, she saw a few journalists still gathered near the main gate, talking excitedly into their microphones. She turned away, choosing not to engage. At the end of the block, her car waited. The driver opened the door and handed her a tablet. On the screen were several news clips already circulating online. She hesitated before pressing play. The video showed exactly what she expected. The officer yelling, the crowd reacting the moment his hand struck her. The camera shook slightly as the person filming gasped. Then it showed her face, calm, still, and silent. Reina watched for a few seconds, then turned off the screen. "Delete the file," she said softly. The driver nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As the car pulled away from the courthouse, she looked out the window at the city passing by. She wasn't angry anymore. She was thoughtful. She understood that sometimes life threw unexpected challenges to test one's discipline and character. What mattered wasn't the mistake itself, but how it was handled afterward. She knew she would have to return to the courthouse again soon, maybe even face that officer again once the internal inquiry started. But she also knew something else. The truth had a way of surfacing, and when it did, people would see who she really was. Not the woman in that short, unfair video clip. As the car turned a corner, her phone buzzed again. A message from her U.S. supervisor appeared on the screen. "Saw the news. Proud of how you handled it. Stay focused. We'll back you fully." She smiled faintly and set the phone aside. The city lights were starting to flicker on as the sun dipped lower behind the buildings. Another long day was over, but the story wasn't finished yet. Somewhere deep down, Reina felt that what had started as a misunderstanding was going to reveal something much bigger than anyone expected. The next morning came quietly, but it didn't feel calm. Reina sat in her apartment near the city center, sipping coffee as her phone buzzed nonstop. She had expected the attention to fade overnight, but instead, it had only grown. News outlets had picked up the video from the courthouse, and by sunrise it was everywhere. The clip had been replayed on talk shows, analyzed online, and discussed on social media with thousands of comments. Most people were angry at the officer, but some were simply curious. Who was this quiet woman who stayed calm after being struck in public? Reina turned off the screen. She didn't need to read any of it. She had lived long enough in her line of work to know how quickly public stories twisted the truth. For her, this was not about going viral. It was about protecting her credibility and keeping her mission on track. Her small apartment was simple. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph on her desk. It showed a group of agents from different countries standing together after a joint operation years ago. She was in the middle, smiling slightly. Her hair shorter back then. It was a reminder of how far she'd come, and of the responsibility that came with her badge. Her phone rang again, and she finally answered. It was the head of the Joint Task Force speaking from Washington. His tone was calm but firm. "We saw the footage, Reina. It's already in the international press. You did well not to react, but this has turned political." She sighed softly. "I figured it would." "Tokyo headquarters has already issued a statement confirming your role," he continued. They're requesting a quiet resolution. We'll support you from here, but you may need to make a brief appearance this afternoon. Appearance? She asked. Yes. A public confirmation at the embassy, nothing dramatic. Just a statement to clarify who you are and that you were there on official duty. It'll calm things down, Raina hesitated. She disliked being in front of cameras, but she understood the necessity. Understood, she said finally. I'll be there. After hanging up, she sat for a moment staring out the window. The city outside moved as usual. People hurrying to work, traffic humming steadily. Life didn't stop for anyone, no matter how intense yesterday had been. By noon, she arrived at the U.S. Embassy. Security officers greeted her respectfully at the gate, offering quiet nods. Inside, the atmosphere was professional but tense. Reporters had gathered outside the perimeter, hoping for a statement. Raina walked past them, calm and expressionless. The embassy's public relations officer met her at the entrance. Agent Raina, thank you for coming. The ambassador asked to see you first. She followed him through the quiet halls to a private office where the ambassador waited. He rose when she entered, extending a hand. Good to finally meet you in person, he said warmly. Though I wish it were under better circumstances. She smiled politely. I appreciate your time, sir. He motioned for her to sit. I've read your record. Impressive background. You've handled some of the toughest cases between our agencies. I can imagine yesterday wasn't easy. It was unfortunate, she said simply, but I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it should be. The ambassador nodded. That's exactly what we're trying to prevent. We'll make a brief statement, acknowledge the misunderstanding, and emphasize cooperation between our governments. We want the focus back on your investigation, not the incident. That's all I want, she agreed. When the meeting ended, she was escorted to a small press room. A few reporters from Japanese and international outlets were already seated. Cameras positioned, microphones ready. Raina stood behind the podium, the embassy seal behind her. The ambassador began with a short introduction, thanking everyone for coming. Then he invited her to speak. Raina took a quiet breath and looked at the faces in front of her. She could feel the tension in the room, the curiosity, the judgment, but she spoke with calm confidence. Yesterday's incident outside the courthouse was the result of a misunderstanding during heightened security procedures. I want to make it clear that I have deep respect for the Japanese police and their dedication to public safety. My purpose here is to assist in an international investigation regarding financial crimes that affect both our countries. I am grateful for the cooperation and professionalism of the authorities moving forward. Her voice was steady, simple, and direct. She didn't sound angry, nor did she sound defensive. She sounded human. Someone who understood mistakes could happen, but who also valued accountability. When she finished, the reporters shouted questions. She only answered a few, staying careful not to turn it into a debate. After a few minutes, the press conference ended. Cameras clicked as she left the podium, escorted by embassy staff. Outside, the noise of reporters faded. Raina walked into the embassy courtyard and let out a slow breath. She felt lighter somehow, as if she'd just closed a door behind her, but she knew it wasn't over. The officer from yesterday was still under investigation, and though she didn't seek revenge, she knew justice would have to take its course. Later that evening, she received a call from the Inspector General of the Tokyo Police Department. His tone was respectful, almost nervous. Agent Raina, I wanted to inform you personally that the officer involved in yesterday's event has been suspended pending review. I also want to thank you for the grace you showed during and after the incident. It prevented a serious escalation. Raina listened quietly. I appreciate your update. Please remind your officers that professionalism is the foundation of trust. That's what keeps cooperation strong. Yes, absolutely, he said quickly. We're implementing additional training immediately. Good, she replied softly. Then we can move on. When she hung up, she set her phone aside and sat by the window again. The city lights flickered like stars below. The sky was clear, and for the first time in 2 days, she allowed herself to relax. But just as she began to unwind, her laptop chimed with an alert. It was a secure message from her FBI contact in Tokyo. She opened it, expecting a routine update, but what she read made her sit upright. The message contained an internal memo. Subject linked to your current investigation spotted near the courthouse during the incident. Her eyes narrowed. It wasn't just a random morning after all. Someone connected to the international case had been in that same crowd, when the officer stopped her. The memo included a blurred photo taken from surveillance footage. A man standing among the onlookers wearing a dark cap and glasses, watching her carefully. Raina's pulse quickened. She replayed the moment in her memory, the faces around her, the crowd murmuring. Could he have been there to observe her? Or was it coincidence? She typed a quick response. Requesting facial analysis and movement trace. Send me all available data. The reply came minutes later. On it. Preliminary match to a middleman suspected of transferring funds for the primary suspect. Raina leaned back slowly, processing the information. So the chaos outside the courthouse might not have been entirely accidental. Someone could have been watching, waiting for confirmation of her identity. The public scene had not only exposed her to the media, it might have exposed her to the very criminals she was tracking. She closed her laptop and sat in silence for a long moment. The realization sent a cold chill through her. Everything she had worked to keep discreet was now out in the open. Her cover as a low-profile liaison was gone. She stood and looked at her reflection in the window. Her face was calm as always, but her mind was already moving fast. If someone had used the incident to confirm her identity, then the next step in their plan was already underway. Her phone buzzed again. Another message appeared from her contact. He boarded a train heading west after leaving the courthouse area. Disappeared from cameras an hour later. Raina grabbed her coat. She wasn't going to sit still. She called her driver and gave quick instructions. I need to head to the regional bureau. Now. The city lights blurred past the car windows as they sped through the evening traffic. Her thoughts raced with them. The investigation had just shifted into dangerous territory, and she was at the center of it. The slap that had humiliated her publicly might have been the spark that exposed something far larger, someone trying to disrupt their entire operation. And now that she was no longer invisible, she would have to face whatever came next head-on. But there was one thing Raina was sure of. She would not let fear or anger control her. She had endured worse in her career and survived it all by staying steady. This was no different. She looked out at the glowing skyline, her expression firm. Somewhere out there, someone thought they had gained the upper hand, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. The city kept moving as she rode deeper into the night, ready for whatever was waiting next. ChatGPT said. The car moved quickly through the city streets, weaving past traffic as Raina's mind worked at full speed. Every instinct told her that the man spotted near the courthouse was more than a bystander. Someone had been watching her, following her movements. The thought was unnerving, but she didn't show it. Calmness had always been her armor, and she wore it now as tightly as ever. When they arrived at the regional bureau, security was already aware she was coming. Officers at the gate gave her respectful nods as she stepped out of the car, her briefcase in hand. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter than the courthouse. It was orderly, professional, and controlled, the perfect place to plan her next steps. A senior analyst met her in the lobby, holding a tablet with updated surveillance data. Agent Raina. We've traced his movements after leaving the courthouse. He boarded a train heading west as you were notified. CCTV coverage shows him leaving the station about 2 hours ago and entering a private building. Raina scanned the images. The man had tried to disguise his face, but there was enough visible to match him to the person in the original surveillance memo. His movements were deliberate, almost cautious, like someone who knew they might be watched but wanted to remain unnoticed. Any idea who he is? She asked, her tone steady but her eyes sharp. Preliminary analysis suggests he is a middleman linked to the suspect organization. The analyst replied. He's been involved in transferring funds internationally, mostly low-profile movements, but his presence yesterday near the courthouse was unusual. We don't know if he recognized you, but it's possible. Raina nodded. We need more than preliminary. Track everyone in that building. Get me floor plans, security cameras, and entry logs. I want a complete picture. The analyst typed rapidly, ending commands to the surveillance team. Within minutes, they started feeding data to her screen. Floor plans, keycard entries, and timestamps appeared in a tidy sequence. Raina studied them, noting every entrance and exit. She quickly realized the building was a front for a legitimate business, but the internal layout suggested areas inaccessible to normal staff, likely used to conceal sensitive operations. This is more than casual observation, she said quietly. He wasn't just watching yesterday. He was confirming information. We need to act before he disappears again. The senior officer beside her nodded. Understood. We can coordinate with local authorities to prepare discreet surveillance teams. They'll keep eyes on him without alarming anyone. Raina leaned back thinking. She needed to be careful. Any hasty move could alert him, and if he were part of a larger network, he would disappear quickly. Her next steps had to be calculated, precise, and quiet. She picked up her phone and called her U.S. contact. I want to run a joint surveillance operation. Use both local teams and international contacts. We can't afford mistakes. Minutes later, arrangements were made. Surveillance teams were deployed to observe entrances and exits without revealing their presence. Agents were instructed to monitor not only the man but anyone who might approach or leave the building. Raina stayed at the bureau, coordinating updates, reviewing data, and preparing for what might come next. As evening fell, she finally allowed herself a small moment of reflection. The past 2 days had been intense. The incident outside the courthouse, the public attention, and now this unexpected development. Yet she didn't feel overwhelmed. In fact, she felt more focused than ever. She reviewed the footage from the courthouse one more time. The officer's aggression, the crowd, and the subtle movements of people nearby all now seemed significant. Her calmness had drawn attention not just from onlookers, but from someone watching with intent. It was almost ironic. Her composure, which had seemed so ordinary to the officer outside, had inadvertently revealed her presence to the right eyes. Hours later, just past midnight, a subtle alert came in from one of the field agents. The man had left the building and was moving toward the docks area along the river. Raina leaned forward, examining the real-time GPS feed. He wasn't alone. There were 2 others with him, carrying small packages. This could be a transfer, she said to the officer beside her. We need to intercept before they get away with anything critical. The officer nodded, issuing quiet commands over the radio. Teams were positioned along the riverbanks, ready to follow without making a scene. Raina felt a quiet thrill. This was the kind of moment she had trained for, where observation, patience, and planning came together. The movement of the suspects was slow but deliberate. Raina and her team could see them loading packages onto a small boat. She noted the timing, the coordination, and the route. It was clear that they had planned this meticulously. If anyone had acted rashly, the opportunity would have been lost. Wait for the right moment, Raina said softly. Do not engage until we know exactly who we are dealing with. We cannot afford mistakes. The agents obeyed. They had learned long ago that her calmness was as strategic as any weapon. Raina monitored everything from the control room, tracking their progress on multiple screens. Finally, the boat moved into a narrow channel, away from public view. Raina gave the signal. A discreet team of officers intercepted quietly from the riverbank, approaching the suspects without alarming them. Within minutes, the 3 individuals were detained. The packages were inspected, revealing documents and electronic devices linked to the international fraud network. Raina exhaled slowly, a sense of relief washing over her. The operation had been clean, precise, and successful. No one was harmed, no unnecessary attention was drawn, and critical intelligence had been secured. As the suspects were escorted to a secure location, Raina reviewed the documents. They contained detailed financial records, communication logs, and encrypted messages that would help unravel the network she had been tracking. Her intuition had been right. The man at the courthouse had been more than a passerby. He was a small part of a much larger operation. She allowed herself a small smile. Moments like these reminded her why she endured long hours, public scrutiny, and occasional danger. It wasn't about recognition, it was about results, about making a difference. By early morning, the city was quiet again. Raina stood near the window of the regional bureau, watching the first light of day reflect off the skyscrapers. She felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The incident at the courthouse, which had seemed like a disruption, had actually revealed something vital. Her composure had not only prevented a scandal but had also uncovered a lead that could take down a major criminal network. Her phone buzzed with incoming messages from both Japanese and U.S. contacts. Preliminary analysis of the confiscated data was underway. She would need to brief senior officials soon, but for now, she allowed herself to breathe. It was in that quiet moment that she realized something important. Strength wasn't only about physical skill or authority, it was about presence. about the way one carried oneself even when underestimated. Her calmness, her restraint, her patience, all of it had led to this success. The slap that had seemed like humiliation yesterday now appeared almost symbolic, a test she had passed without flinching. The operation would continue over the next several days, connecting financial dots and identifying key players. Raina knew she would be back in courtrooms, boardrooms, and conference rooms soon, facing more challenges. But she also knew that the foundation of her work, discipline, focus, and quiet confidence, was unshakable. She sat back, letting her hands rest on the table. Her mind was already thinking ahead, planning the next steps in the investigation. But in that moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of accomplishment. She had handled public humiliation, potential exposure, and a critical operation, all with poise and precision. And she knew that whatever came next, she would face it the same way, calm, calculated, and completely in control. The world outside might judge quickly, misunderstand often, and challenge her constantly, but inside she carried her own strength. The slap that had frozen everyone in place at the courthouse had not diminished her. It had only revealed the power she had always held quietly. The city stirred to life as the morning sun rose higher, and Raina prepared to step back into the world outside. She knew there were more challenges ahead, more dangers to navigate, and more people who would underestimate her, but she was ready. As she gathered her briefcase and headed toward the operations room, one thought remained clear in her mind. Calm, focus, and patience were her greatest weapons, and with them, nothing could shake her. The morning light streamed into Raina's apartment as she prepared for another day at the bureau. After the previous night's operation, she had hardly slept. Her mind kept replaying every detail: the man at the courthouse, the boat at the river, the packages, the documents. Even though the immediate danger had passed, she knew this was only the beginning of a larger investigation. She dressed in her usual professional attire, simple but sharp, carrying her briefcase with practiced precision. Every movement was deliberate, reflecting the discipline she had honed over years in the field. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror and gave herself a small nod. Calmness wasn't just a state of mind, it was a signal, a way to control the world around her when chaos threatened. When she arrived at the bureau, she was greeted with quiet respect. Officers and analysts who had been part of the river interception operation nodded at her, their faces reflecting both relief and admiration. She offered a small smile in return but didn't linger. There was work to do. The operation team briefed her on the latest developments. The documents recovered from the river package revealed a network of transactions that spanned multiple countries. Financial records indicated shell companies, offshore accounts, and coded messages that only someone with experience could interpret. Raina pored over the data, highlighting connections and cross-referencing details with what she already knew from previous intelligence. Hours passed, the team working in silence under her direction. Raina's focus was absolute, and it was contagious. Analysts leaned closer, asking clarifying questions, making suggestions, and discussing possible leads. Her calm, patient responses kept the room grounded. Nothing was dismissed. Every detail mattered. Around midday, her phone buzzed with a secure message from the embassy liaison. It was a notice that the officer who had struck her at the courthouse had been officially disciplined. His actions had caused enough public concern and internal review that suspension was inevitable. Raina didn't feel triumph. This wasn't about personal victory, but she acknowledged the importance of accountability. Systems needed to work and respect had to be maintained, especially when different agencies worked together. She paused for a moment, thinking about the incident. The slap that had shocked bystanders and even the officers themselves now seemed almost symbolic. It had tested her patience, her composure, and her ability to respond without letting emotion take over. In that brief moment, she had shown control, a